1860, Louisiana stood on the edge of collapse. The air was thick with heat, tension, and the slow decay of a world built on human suffering. Cotton fields stretched like white seas across the Mississippi Delta, their beauty hiding the stench of sweat and fear. Slavery had made the South rich, but now that same system was beginning to rot from the inside. And nowhere was that rot more visible than on the modest 200 acres of the Delaney Plantation. Unlike the great estates that boasted marble columns and endless rows of cotton, the Delaney property was small, fading, weather-beaten, and filled with the ghosts of better years. Clement Delaney, its owner, was a man caught between failure and madness. He wasn't a wealthy baron or a politician. He was a desperate farmer trying to hold on to a world that was already slipping through his calloused fingers. Clement owned 15 slaves, too few to impress his neighbors, yet too many to live without the moral poison of ownership. His house, a 2-story wooden structure once painted white, now peeled and sagged with neglect. Inside those walls, something dark was growing. It began quietly, as all horrors do. A man's pride wounded by debt, his mind corroded by obsession, and a family trapped inside his crumbling version of order and control. His wife, Joanna Delaney, had once been the heart of the household. But by her late 30s, life had drained her color. The constant worry of unpaid debts and Clement's nightly absences left her pale and anxious. Their 3 daughters, Arlene, Carolyn, and Frida, were the last remaining symbols of hope, beauty, and innocence within those decaying walls. Each carried something of their parents: Arlene's golden hair, Carolyn's quiet grace, Frida's untamed spirit. But innocence cannot survive in a place like Delaney Plantation. Every morning, as mist rolled off the river, the sound of iron chains clinked in rhythm with the cries of crows. The slaves worked under a sun that seemed to never forgive, watched by a master who had begun to look at them differently, not as workers, but as numbers, flesh, and profit. His obsession with control grew as his finances dwindled, and soon even his family began to feel like property in his mind. By 1859, Clement's debts had become impossible to hide. Merchants from New Orleans appeared at his doorstep, polite smiles masking their hunger for repayment. He sold 3 of his strongest slaves to keep the farm alive, and something inside him broke that day. He realized how easily a man could turn life into currency. And once that thought took hold, it never left. This is the story of what happened next. A story so disturbing, most historians still refuse to speak of it. Because what Clement Delaney did in the years leading up to the Civil War was not just a crime against his family or against his slaves. It was a crime against nature itself. Before we continue, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? And if this is your first time here at Legacy of Fear, don't forget to subscribe for more stories that will keep you awake at night. By the winter of 1858, the Delaney Plantation was barely standing. The cotton fields that once shimmered under the southern sun now lay sickly and thin. A blight had swept through the Delta that year, killing half the harvest and leaving farmers across Louisiana gasping for survival. For men like Clement Delaney, who already lived on the knife's edge of debt, it was a death sentence wrapped in soil. The banks in New Orleans were merciless. Clement had borrowed money with interest that could break a king, betting everything on the next good harvest. But when the cotton failed, so did his luck. He found himself cornered by creditors, by humiliation, and by the slow realization that the life he built was crumbling beyond repair. And so he turned to gambling. It began innocently, as it often does. A few hands of cards at a tavern in the French Quarter, a few lucky wins that made him believe Providence was on his side. But luck is a cruel illusion. Within months, the games became longer, the drinks stronger, and the losses unbearable. When Clement returned home in the early mornings, his boots were caked with the filth of city streets, and his breath smelled of whiskey and failure. Joanna would wait for him by the window, her hands trembling as she asked the same question. "Did you win this time?" The answer was always silence. Inside the house, tension had become a living thing. The daughters could hear their parents arguing through thin wooden walls, Joanna's pleading voice, Clement's slurred fury. The slaves, too, began to whisper about the master's growing instability. Tobias, the overseer, once respected for his strength and fairness, noticed that Clement no longer spoke to him as a man, but barked orders like a machine on the verge of breaking down. In early 1859, men in fine suits began to appear at the plantation. They weren't guests, they were debt collectors. They arrived in polished carriages carrying papers and smiles that cut like blades. They spoke the language of law and ownership, explaining how Clement's debts could soon mean the end of everything he owned, including his slaves, his home, and his land. The day Clement sold 3 of his strongest workers, the plantation fell silent. Even the birds seemed to sense that something sacred had been violated. The transaction took place right there in the front yard, under the magnolia trees. The buyers inspected the slaves like livestock, teeth, muscles, scars, and Clement stood by, his face expressionless, as each man and woman was priced, bartered, and sold. That moment changed him. Something in his eyes hardened, as though the part of his soul that could feel pity had been ripped away. He began speaking less, spending hours in his study, staring at ledgers filled with numbers that no longer made sense. Joanna once caught him whispering to himself, repeating figures under his breath as if they were prayers. That same night, Clement began studying the law, slave codes, inheritance laws, property rights. He claimed it was for business purposes, but what he was really searching for was a loophole, a way out, a way to turn human life into money without ever leaving his land again. And in that search, he would soon discover something buried deep in the laws of slavery, something old, cruel, and terrifyingly useful. Before we continue, if you're still watching, drop a skull emoji in the comments, because from this point on, the story of Clement Delaney only gets darker. By the spring of 1859, something had shifted in Clement Delaney. He still walked the same fields, still greeted his neighbors with forced politeness, but his mind was somewhere else, lost in pages of books and papers that no farmer should ever have been reading. He had begun collecting law manuals from the parish courthouse in New Orleans, dusty volumes written in small print about property, inheritance, and the legal codes of slavery. Joanna didn't understand why her husband spent entire nights hunched over them, the lamplight reflecting off his tired eyes. When she asked, he smiled faintly and said, "A man ought to understand the laws that govern his land." But these weren't just any laws. They were the blueprints of ownership, rules that defined how human beings could be turned into property, traded and inherited like cattle. And buried within those laws, Clement found something ancient, something that would plant a seed of horror in his mind. It was a Latin phrase written in a faded text from the colonial era. Partus sequitur ventrum. The child follows the condition of the mother. It meant that if a woman was enslaved, her child would be born a slave, no matter who the father was. Even if the father was white, even if he was her owner. The realization hit Clement like a revelation. He didn't just see a law, he saw opportunity. If a child's status followed the mother, then the opposite must also be true in reverse. A free woman's child, no matter who fathered it, was free. That meant the only thing separating property from person was paperwork, a record, a certificate, a name on a page. And in that distinction, Clement saw salvation for his collapsing fortune. He began visiting New Orleans more often, not for gambling this time, but for something far darker. In the shadowed corners of the French Quarter, he met a man known as Bogard, a document forger who could make a birth record vanish or appear with a stroke of his pen. Bogard was a ghost of a man, pale, quiet, and paid in gold. For $50 per certificate, he could create life, or erase it, from the legal world entirely. When Clement returned home, he carried a leather briefcase filled with these documents. He locked it in his office and warned everyone, even Joanna, never to enter without his permission. Soon after, he began making changes around the plantation. Small things at first, new locks on the doors, strange measurements of the bedrooms, whispered instructions to Tobias about reorganizing the slave quarters. No one understood the purpose, not even Tobias himself. But Joanna sensed something wrong. Her husband's eyes no longer looked at her with affection or even anger. They were cold, analytical, like a man studying livestock. Sometimes she would catch him watching their daughters at dinner, not as a father, but as a farmer evaluating a harvest. And when she tried to ask what was wrong, Clement only said one thing: "Don't worry, Joanna. I found a way to save us all." If she had known what he truly meant by save, she would have taken her children and run that night. But by the time she understood, The doors of Delaney Plantation were already locked from the inside. Before we move on, take a second and think about this. What kind of desperation makes a man see his own family as currency? Comment your thoughts below, because in the next part, Clement's obsession turns into a plan that will shatter every line between father, master, and monster. By the time summer arrived in 1859, Clement Delaney had stopped pretending to be a man of conscience. His polite smile vanished. His church attendance ceased. The few neighbors who still visited the Delaney plantation noticed something different in his manner, a watchfulness, a sharpness in his gaze as though he were always measuring, always calculating. He spent most days shut inside his study, surrounded by ledgers and letters from New Orleans. The sound of his quill scratching paper became a constant in the house. Even Joanna, once accustomed to her husband's long silences, began to feel the presence of something unnatural growing inside those walls. Clement had come to believe that God or fate had shown him a path out of ruin. Doctrine of partus sequitur ventrum was not merely law to him, it was revelation. It proved in his twisted mind that the line between freedom and slavery could be bent, rewritten, even reversed. If a free woman's child was free, then all he needed to do was change the paperwork, change the mother. He could take any newborn, assign it a false lineage, and the law would accept it. And if those infants happened to resemble his daughters or his slaves, well, no one would ask questions, not in a world where flesh was currency. It began as an idea whispered in the dark, then became an obsession. Clement started keeping notes on the health and fertility of every woman on the plantation. He recorded their ages, their menstrual cycles, their strength. It was as if he were conducting an experiment. Tobias, the overseer, often saw him walking through the quarters at night, lantern in hand, scribbling into a small black notebook. When Tobias finally asked what he was doing, Clement simply replied, "I'm saving this place. You'll thank me when it's over." The next morning, new locks appeared on the slave cabins. The women were moved into separate quarters. Clement said it was to prevent temptation and maintain order. But even the youngest on the plantation could sense the lie. Leah, a house servant who had worked for the family since childhood, was one of the first to feel his gaze change. He began asking her strange questions, how often she felt ill, when she last bled, whether she had ever lost a child. His tone was clinical, not cruel, and somehow that made it worse. Meanwhile, Joanna tried to preserve a sense of normalcy. She kept the house clean, maintained Sunday dinners, and reminded her daughters to smile when their father entered the room. But the girls were no longer blind to the tension. Arlene, the eldest, whispered to Carolyn one evening that she caught their father staring at her reflection in the window. Not in anger or affection, but in assessment. Clement's mind was no longer his own. He had become a man dissecting morality piece by piece until nothing remained but the machinery of greed. He saw his plantation as a dying enterprise, and his family as the raw material to resurrect it. In his study, surrounded by legal codes and forged documents, Clement Delaney wrote the words that would define his dissent. Every life has value when it is measured correctly. Before we continue, if you've been following this story, you already know we're crossing into a place darker than law or sin. Stay with me, because in the next section, Clement's plan begins to take physical form, and Delaney Plantation starts its transformation into something no one could have imagined. By early 1860, the Delaney house had changed in ways that no visitor could quite explain. From the outside, it looked the same, a weathered two-story home shaded by cypress trees with ivy crawling across its porch. But inside, everything was different. The air was thick, heavy, and silent. The laughter of the Delaney daughters had disappeared, replaced by the sound of keys turning in new locks that Clement had ordered installed on nearly every door. He told Joanna it was for safety. Rumors of slave uprisings had been circulating through the Delta, and fear spread faster than truth. But even she could tell these locks were not meant to keep danger out. They were designed to keep someone in. The first to notice the true purpose of Clement's modifications was Tobias. As overseer, he was accustomed to maintaining the slave quarters. But one morning he was summoned to help Clement reinforce several doors in the main house. When he asked why they needed such heavy bolts on the inside of the bedrooms, Clement smiled thinly and said, Security is a luxury, Tobias. I'm simply ensuring we have enough of it. That evening, Tobias confided to Laya that the master's tone chilled him more than any threat ever had. "It's like he's building a prison," he whispered. Laya only nodded, because she'd already seen the same madness growing behind Clement's polite facade. Joanna felt it too. Her husband's presence filled the house like a storm that never ended. He spoke little, but his eyes never stopped moving. He watched his daughters closely, studying their posture, their health, the color in their cheeks. At dinner, he took notes between bites, scribbling quietly while the girls sat stiffly at the table. When Joanna asked what he was writing, he said only, "I'm observing patterns." Patterns. It was a word that meant nothing to her, but it would come to define everything that followed. By February 1860, Clement had begun making frequent trips to New Orleans again. He returned each time with small packages, bundles of papers, medical instruments, and once a brown glass bottle with a handwritten label, "Tincture for Women's Balance." He told Joanna it was for the girls' health, a herbal remedy to keep them strong. She believed him at first, but soon she noticed that after taking it, her daughters often felt dizzy, nauseous, and weak. One night, when the house was quiet, Joanna crept into her husband's study. The smell of ink and brandy hung in the air. On his desk, she found stacks of notes written in his tidy hand, pages filled with names, dates, and phrases she didn't understand. Ovulation, intervals, viability. She turned the page and froze. There, written in bold black letters, was the phrase that reproduction schedule, Delaney line. When Clement discovered her the next morning, he said nothing. He simply took the pages from her hands, folded them neatly, and locked them in his desk. His voice was calm when he finally spoke. "You shouldn't worry yourself with things you can't comprehend." From that day on, Joanna stopped asking questions. She moved through the house like a ghost, clutching her rosary, praying for an answer that would never come. And upstairs, behind locked doors, 3 daughters began to realize their father's love had curdled into something unspeakable. Before we continue, what would you have done if you were Joanna? Run, confront him, or stay silent out of fear? Tell me in the comments, because in the next part, Clement's plan stops being theory and becomes terrifying reality. Spring came early that year, and with it, the scent of rot. The swamp behind Delaney Plantation began to swell, flooding the lower fields and leaving behind a layer of black mud that stuck to everything it touched. The slaves whispered that the earth itself was rejecting the place, that something unholy had been planted there. Clement, however, seemed invigorated. He spent his mornings in the study and his afternoons in the fields, carrying a new leather-bound book that he guarded like scripture. He called it the ledger. It wasn't a record of debts or crop yields. It was something far more disturbing, a meticulous list of names, ages, and menstrual cycles of every woman on the plantation. Each name had notations beside it, symbols, calculations, and strange markings written in his tight, mechanical script. He was tracking their fertility. Joanna didn't know this, of course. She only noticed that Clement's interest in the women had become obsessive. He'd summon them to the house for medical inspection, forcing them to undress while he examined them under the guise of ensuring their health. He even paid a midwife from Baton Rouge to visit once a month, though she seemed to leave with more money than questions. The truth was simple and monstrous. Clement Delaney was attempting to breed ownership. His plan was to pair select women with men of strong build, control their pregnancies, and document the results. Any children born healthy would be registered as property of Delaney estate. But if any were born sick, weak, or deformed, they disappeared from the ledger entirely. No one knew where they went. Laya, who had grown up in the house, began to sense that the rooms themselves were hiding something. At night, she'd hear faint cries from the cellar, too soft to be human, too short to be natural. Once she followed the sound and saw Clement himself carrying a bundle down the narrow steps beneath the study. When he returned, his sleeves were wet. Meanwhile, Joanna's health was failing. She had grown pale and nervous, unable to sleep. Every time Clement left his study, she could hear him locking the door behind him. Sometimes she'd hear whispering, his voice reciting prayers, only twisted, unfamiliar, spoken like formulas rather than faith. The plantation's priest, Father Moreau, came once in April. Joanna tried to tell him she feared her husband had lost his soul. But before she could finish, Clement entered the room, smiling his polite southern smile. "My wife's been unwell," he said smoothly. "A touch of hysteria. You understand." The priest nodded and left within the hour. He never came back. That night, Joanna dreamed of water. Dark, thick water rising up through the floorboards, swallowing the house. When she woke, her pillow was wet with tears, and somewhere in the distance, a baby cried. The next morning, Clement added a new column to his ledger. It read, "Maternal success rate." He underlined it twice. "Before we continue, take a moment to breathe, because in the next section, we'll see what happened when Clement's experiment turned against him, when one woman decided she would rather burn than bear another life into his hell." By the summer of 1860, the women of Delaney Plantation had stopped speaking to one another, not out of anger, but out of fear. They had learned that words were dangerous, that even a whisper could make its way to the master's ears, and then someone would vanish. First, it was Maybelle, a young mother whose newborn had been taken for inspection. Then it was Ruth, whose swollen belly disappeared one morning, and whose cabin stood empty by dusk. Clement claimed they had been sent to convalesce, but everyone knew better. The swamps had begun to feed on secrets. Leah was the first to break the silence. She was no longer the timid servant who once bowed her head when Clement passed by. She had seen too much, the ledger, the locks, the cellar, and she had heard the truth from the lips of a dying woman named Ruth. Ruth's last words were barely a whisper. "He takes the children, writes them dead, sells them alive." Those 6 words became Leah's reason to live. She began leaving signs, small pieces of resistance that only the women understood. A scrap of cloth tied around a door meant Clement was nearby. A smudge of ash on a windowsill meant someone had gone missing. They called it the Silent Rebellion. Meanwhile, Joanna grew weaker. Her eyes were sunken, her hands trembling. She moved through the house in a daze, clutching a rosary that had long since lost its power. But she wasn't blind to what was happening anymore. She had found the ledger, again hidden beneath a false bottom in Clement's desk, and she had read it from start to finish. Every entry, every name, every erased child. Her daughters were listed there too, not as family, but as assets. The words "potential bearer" appeared beside Arlene's name. Joanna vomited when she saw it. She wanted to run, to take her girls and flee into the swamp, but she knew Clement would find them. He always did, so she turned to the only person she could trust, Leah. One night, while Clement was away in New Orleans, Joanna met her in the kitchen. The candles were nearly burnt out, and the air smelled of fear. "You have to end this," Joanna whispered. Leah shook her head. "You know what that means." "I do," Joanna said. "And I'll help you." The plan was simple but desperate. They would wait until Clement returned, then burn the ledger, the study, and everything inside it. Without his records, his experiment would collapse. But plans are fragile things in places already cursed. Clement came home early, and the night that was meant to bring freedom became a massacre. By dawn, the air around Delaney Plantation was filled with smoke, screams, and the smell of burning paper. And in the ashes, only one page survived, the one bearing the name Leah Viable. Before we continue, remember this: evil rarely dies clean. In the next section, the flames reveal what Clement truly created, and what refused to die in that house. The fire began in the study. A single candle, left burning on the desk, caught the edge of Clement's ledger. Within minutes, the flames had consumed the papers, the curtains, and the oak-paneled walls that had once held his secrets. Smoke climbed the staircase like a living thing, curling into every room, filling the house with the smell of scorched ink and oil. By the time Clement woke, the night was already red. He ran through the halls shouting for his wife, his daughters, his servants. But the air only answered with crackling wood and the dull roar of fire devouring his empire. He found Joanna in the corridor, her hair singed, her nightgown streaked with soot. She wasn't running. She was waiting. "It's over," she said, her voice breaking. No more experiments, no more blood. God forgive you. But Clement was past forgiveness. He lunged for her, dragging her toward the study, screaming about salvation, about legacy, about how she didn't understand what he had achieved. When Laia burst into the room with a poker in hand, she saw something that no one could have imagined. Clement Delaney wasn't trying to save his ledger. He was trying to save the cradle. A wooden cradle, small, carved by hand, its sides lined with damp cloth to keep it cool. Inside it lay a child, but the child wasn't crying. It wasn't moving. Its skin was pale as wax, its eyes open but unfocused, and yet when Laia stepped closer, she saw its chest rise. Just barely. Clement's voice trembled as he spoke. She lived. The others failed, but this one, she lived. She's perfect. Joanna screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the fire. She grabbed the cradle, intending to throw it into the flames, but Clement struck her across the face, sending her sprawling. Laia attacked him then, striking his head with the iron poker again and again, until he fell, blood spilling across the floorboards. The cradle tipped. The child inside rolled out onto the floor. It let out a sound, not a cry, not human exactly. A sharp guttural gasp, like air escaping a dying lung. For one moment it opened its mouth wider than should have been possible, and the flicker of firelight caught something moving inside, a dark membrane, pulsing. Laia froze. Then she did the only thing she could. She wrapped the infant in a cloth, carried it outside, and threw it into the burning field. By sunrise, the Delaney mansion was gone. Only its brick chimney remained standing like a gravestone. Clement's body was never found. Some said he burned. Others swore they saw him wandering the swamp in the weeks that followed, his face blackened, his hand still clutching a piece of that ruined ledger. But one thing is certain, something survived that fire. And decades later, when the land was resettled and new foundations were laid, construction crews unearthed a small object near the old well, charred but intact. It was a cradle, and inside it, the imprint of something that had once been alive. Before we continue, ask yourself this. What if that child wasn't just his creation, but his punishment? Because in the next section we'll uncover what happened after the fire, when the Delaney name refused to die, and the curse began to spread through bloodlines. After the fire of 1860, Delaney Plantation became a place people crossed themselves to avoid. The chimney still stood, a tall, blackened pillar rising from the ashes, and locals began calling it the Devil's Spine. No birds nested there. No grass grew around it, and those who ventured close swore they could hear a faint humming sound, like breath moving through hollow stone. Officially, the fire was ruled accidental. The county clerk recorded it as an unfortunate domestic blaze resulting in the total loss of property and the presumed death of the owner. But in the nearby parish of St. Mary, stories began to spread, stories that didn't come from rumor, but from the mouths of those who had escaped. Laia was one of them. She survived the fire, though her hands and arms were badly burned. She made her way to Baton Rouge and worked for years as a laundress, saying little, keeping her scars hidden. But before her death in 1884, she told a priest something that was recorded in the parish archives under unsubstantiated confession. She said the Delaney bloodline was cursed, not by God, but by what Clement had made. According to her, the child in the cradle did not die in the fire. She claimed she saw it move in the smoke, crawling toward the swamp as the house burned behind it. It was still breathing, she said, still searching. The priest dismissed her words as delirium. But something strange began to happen in the years that followed. Families who settled near the ruins reported livestock dying without reason. Women miscarried repeatedly, and children born in the area, especially those whose parents had built their homes too close to the old chimney, sometimes carried peculiar birthmarks. Long, spiral-shaped scars that seemed burned into their skin. Locals called it the Delaney mark. By 1901, the land had changed owners 3 times. Each time, tragedy followed. One man hanged himself in the barn. Another vanished in the swamp, leaving behind only his boots. And in 1907, when surveyors tried to clear the property for a new plantation road, they found something buried just below the surface. Bones. Small fragile bones arranged in neat rows, as if someone had planted them there deliberately. The county sealed the report, but photographs taken that day still exist. In one of them, you can see the outline of a small rib cage, perfectly preserved in mud, and beside it, a handprint. Too large to belong to a child, too distorted to belong to a man. The Delaney name should have ended with that fire. But history, like blood, has a way of lingering. By the 1920s, distant relatives began to appear. Descendants who claimed to have no connection to Clement Delaney, yet all bearing the same haunting trait. One eye slightly clouded, one tooth misaligned, and a faint spiral scar somewhere on the body. The locals said they were marked. The scholars said it was coincidence. But those who lived near, the Devil's Spine, swore they sometimes saw candlelight flickering among the ruins, just before the screams began. Before we continue, remember this: curses don't haunt places, they haunt families. In the next section, we'll follow the bloodline into the 20th century, to the strange and tragic life of the last living Delaney heir, and the horrifying discovery that finally revealed the truth. By the early 1900s, the Delaney name had almost vanished from Louisiana records. Almost. One branch of the family, thought to have perished in the fire, had quietly resurfaced under a new name, the Caldwells of St. Martin Parish. In 1912, a man named Thomas Caldwell purchased 80 acres near the very edge of the old Delaney property. He was a quiet man, educated in Baton Rouge, who worked as a surveyor for the state. His wife Margaret came from a wealthy New Orleans family. They had one child, Evelyn, born on a rainy night in October of that same year. Neighbors described Thomas as polite but distant, a man who avoided social gatherings and spent long nights in his study, drawing maps no one ever saw. But it was his daughter Evelyn who drew the town's attention. From the time she was 3, she was different. She spoke late, walked late, and spent hours staring at the fireplace, murmuring words no one understood. When she finally began to talk, she told her mother that she had a friend who lived inside the chimney. Margaret, unnerved but indulgent, assumed it was a child's fancy. But then came the night of January 9th, 1917. Margaret woke to the smell of smoke. She ran downstairs and found her daughter standing barefoot before the fire, both hands pressed against the brick as if trying to push through. When she pulled Evelyn back, the girl's palms were red with blisters, but she didn't cry. She just whispered, "He's still hungry." Doctors said the child had suffered night terrors brought on by fever. But Thomas knew better. He'd seen that same phrase before. Hidden inside his desk was an old family ledger, the only surviving document from the Delaney estate. The last entry, written in Clement Delaney's trembling hand, read, "The child will hunger even after the flesh is gone." Thomas never told his wife about the ledger. He burned it 1 week later. But Evelyn's behavior grew stranger. She began collecting bones from the woods, bird bones, raccoon bones, once even the skull of a stray dog. She kept them beneath her bed in neat, symmetrical rows. When Margaret confronted her, Evelyn said, "He tells me how to build them." The whispers in town returned. Some said the child was cursed. Others said she was gifted. The local priest tried to bless the Caldwell home, but when he sprinkled holy water in Evelyn's room, she began to scream, not in pain, but in rage. By 1925, the family's isolation was complete. Thomas had quit his surveying job. Margaret stopped attending church, and Evelyn, now 13, had taken to wandering at night, barefoot, her dress dragging in the dew. Neighbors sometimes found her near the ruins of the old plantation, standing before the Devil's Spine, her eyes fixed on something invisible in the dark. When asked why she went there, she answered simply, "Because that's where my family lives." What happened next would be recorded in the Louisiana Gazette under the headline, "Tragedy at the Old Delaney Grounds, 3 dead in apparent murder-suicide." But as you'll soon hear, the scene investigators found defied everything the human mind could explain. On the morning of March 2nd, 1926, the St. Martin Parish Sheriff's Department received a call from a neighboring farmer who reported a foul smoke and screams coming from the Caldwell property. By the time deputies arrived, the house was silent, its windows blackened, the front door hanging open, and the air thick with the sweet, nauseating scent of burned wood and something far worse. Inside, they found 3 bodies. Thomas Caldwell lay in the study, a pistol still clutched in his hand. A single bullet wound through his temple. Across the room, Margaret's body was found slumped against the wall, her dress soaked in blood, her face twisted not in terror, but confusion. The third body was found upstairs. It was Evelyn, or what was left of her. Her remains were arranged carefully in the center of her bedroom, arms crossed over her chest, eyes open, mouth fixed in a faint smile. Around her, drawn in charcoal and ash, was a spiral symbol, identical to the mark that had once appeared on the Delaney family's slave cabins more than 60 years earlier. The sheriff's report described it as a ritualistic arrangement, possibly indicating mental disturbance or occult practice. But when investigators lifted the girl's body, they discovered something that made even the most hardened men in the room go pale. Beneath her body, the wood of the floorboards had warped outward, as if something beneath had pressed up against it. When they pried the boards loose, they found a shallow cavity, about the size of a cradle. Inside it were bones, dozens of small bones, infant bones, some still wrapped in decaying cloth. The coroner would later confirm they were human remains, at least 7 different infants, buried directly beneath the child's room. No records existed of the Caldwells ever having other children. The sheriff, unable to explain the discovery, ordered the entire property sealed and burned to the ground. The official record lists the incident as a murder-suicide motivated by delusion and stress. But rumors spread quickly across the parish. One deputy claimed he heard a noise while they were clearing the room, a low humming sound, like breath moving through hollow wood. Another swore that as the flames reached the roof, he saw something crawl from the chimney and slip into the nearby swamp, moving faster than any animal he'd ever seen. Within a month, the Caldwell tragedy was forgotten by the press. The land was sold again, this time to the state. But no one ever built there. To this day, locals say the ground still trembles after heavy rain, and that sometimes, if you listen closely near the ruins, you can hear a child's laughter, faint, distant, echoing beneath the soil. They call it the hunger beneath. In the next section, we'll uncover the state investigation that tried to bury the Delaney bloodline once and for all, and how, decades later, one historian would stumble upon evidence suggesting that what happened in 1926 was only the beginning. By the 1950s, the story of the Delaney Plantation and the Caldwell tragedy had faded into half-remembered whispers, folklore buried under layers of dust and polite silence. But in 1954, a young historian from Tulane University named Professor Henry Lawton came across something that would bring those ghosts roaring back into the light. Lawton had been researching postbellum property, transitions in Louisiana for his doctoral thesis, when he stumbled upon a box of sealed documents mislabeled Confederate trade records. Inside were not military papers, but personal correspondences, receipts, letters, and legal drafts signed by one Clement Delaney, dated between 1858 and 1860. Most were mundane, lists of expenses, notes on cotton yields, but among them lay a series of ledger entries written in a cramped, obsessive hand. The handwriting grew shakier with each page. The entries referred to production cycles, breeding intervals, and offspring valuation. The tone was disturbingly clinical. At first, Lawton believed he'd uncovered financial documents related to livestock, but then he noticed the words Leah, Frida, Arlene, and Tobias, names of human beings. And beside them, the chilling notation, product viable. Estimated sale value, $275. Horrified, Lawton continued reading. The later entries contained details so grotesque he refused to publish them in his dissertation. But one note stood out, a line scrawled hastily in red ink at the bottom of the final page. He who owns the mother owns the blood. The blood remembers. It was a phrase he'd later find carved, almost identically into the foundation stone of the devil's spine. Obsessed, Lawton filed requests to access sealed parish records from St. Martin and St. Mary. It took nearly a year before he was granted limited clearance. What he found confirmed his worst fears. The Delaney Plantation fire had indeed been classified as intentional, and human remains, most of them infants, had been recovered but quietly reburied without formal documentation. The deeper he dug, the stranger the coincidences became. In the state archives, He located the Caldwell investigation files from 1926, previously marked destroyed. They were incomplete, but inside the remaining folder was a photograph, the spiral mark drawn in charcoal beneath Evelyn Caldwell's body. It was identical to the spiral symbol that appeared throughout Clement Delaney's journals, a crude spiral made of two concentric circles with a downward stroke cutting through the center. Lawton traced the symbol's origin and found it wasn't unique to Louisiana. Similar patterns appeared in West African cosmology, associated with rituals concerning the return of ancestral spirits through the bloodline. The implication was terrifying. Lawton began to suspect that Clement Delaney's breeding project had not only been a financial scheme, but an attempt to manipulate lineage itself, an unholy merging of superstition and pseudoscience. The idea that a man could bind generations to his will through blood and law. By 1957, Lawton prepared to publish his findings under the title Inheritance of Shadows, the Legal and Occult History of the Delaney Bloodline. But weeks before the book's completion, he vanished. His car was found abandoned on Highway 31, doors open, keys still in the ignition. The passenger seat was soaked in, something dark that police later confirmed was blood. The manuscript was never found, but one page from his notes survived, later recovered from his university office. It contained only 2 sentences, written in shaking handwriting. The bloodline continues. The child of hunger has risen again. In the next section, we'll uncover the modern rediscovery of the Delaney site and the chilling evidence that something beneath that soil is still very much alive. In the summer of 1983, the Louisiana State Historical Society approved a small archaeological dig on the site once known as the Delaney Plantation. The area had long since reverted to wild swamp, a thicket of cypress, reeds, and murky pools where even the locals refused to fish. The excavation team, led by Dr. Margaret Hensley, was tasked with verifying the plantation's boundaries for a proposed heritage restoration project. On their first morning, Hensley's team set up camp near a mound that old parish maps had labeled Delaney Foundation, Main House. But within hours of digging, they realized the site was unlike any other antebellum ruin they'd studied. Beneath just 2 feet of topsoil, they uncovered layers of charred brick fused with something organic, bones, melted glass, and fragments of porcelain dolls. The deeper they went, the stranger the findings became. Human remains, most belonging to children, were found arranged in perfect concentric rings around what appeared to be a collapsed cellar opening. At the center of this circular pit was a slab of stone, blackened, heavy, and engraved with a spiral mark identical to the one found in the Caldwell case and Delaney's journals. Dr. Hensley wrote in her field notes, "Not random, patterned intentionally. This is not a burial ground, it's a design." For the next 3 days, the team carefully documented and photographed everything. But on the 4th night, their campsite was struck by an intense electrical storm. The rain came down in walls. Hensley later described it as the kind of thunder that sounds like something trying to speak. When dawn came, the storm had passed, but 2 graduate assistants were gone. Their tents stood zipped, belongings untouched. No footprints led away from camp. Search dogs brought in the next morning refused to go near the pit. They barked, circled, then bolted back toward the trucks. The sheriff's deputies who responded sealed off the site, labeling the disappearances as likely disorientation and drowning. But privately, Hensley told her colleagues that wasn't possible. The water was only waist deep, and both students were experienced in swamp terrain. A week later, the excavation was shut down without explanation. All field materials, including photos, bone samples, and soil reports, were confiscated by the Department of State Archives under what officials called a containment order. No public record of that order exists today, but a single roll of undeveloped film survived, kept hidden by a technician named Peter Corvin, who smuggled it out before the site was sealed. The photos, developed years later, show what appears to be a crude subterranean chamber beneath the collapsed stone. Within that chamber are what look like wooden restraints and carved symbols painted in a dark, dried substance. The most disturbing image, however, is the last one on the roll. It shows a cracked porcelain doll's face, half buried in mud. The eyes are hollow, but faintly visible inside the sockets are what seem to be human teeth. The photos were quietly passed around among university circles, dismissed as hoaxes or morbid art projects. But Dr. Hensley never recovered from what she'd seen. She left academia, moved to Maine, and lived reclusively until her death in 2009. In her final interview, she said only this: "They didn't just own people, they owned the land. The land remembers." By the early 2000s, the Delaney land, nearly 600 acres of decaying swamp, had been quietly purchased by a private development firm out of Baton Rouge. Their plan was ambitious: to drain and convert the area into a series of luxury lakeside homes under the name Bayou Estates. The company's investors were assured that the site had no legal or historical barriers left. The excavation ban from the 1980s had expired, and the state, eager for economic development, approved the project. Bulldozers rolled in that autumn, carving through what remained of the overgrown plantation ruins. Almost immediately, the crew began reporting problems. Engines stalled without cause. GPS units failed. Workers complained of severe nausea and headaches the closer they came to the old foundation site, the same ground where Dr. Hensley's team had dug 20 years earlier. One foreman, James Rusty Cole, claimed that each morning he'd find his equipment shifted several feet from where it had been left. Once an excavator was discovered idling in reverse, treads sunk deep into the mud, though no one had touched it. On the third week, a worker named Luis Ortega disappeared. His hard hat was found near the center of the site, resting on the exposed slab of black stone Hensley had once uncovered. Beneath it, the ground had collapsed again, revealing a narrow, freshly opened shaft. When rescue teams lowered a camera into the hole, the feed cut out after 15 seconds. The last image transmitted was a rough tunnel lined with decayed wood and a faint red mark spiraling across the walls. Construction halted immediately. Local authorities sealed the pit and classified Ortega's case as a workplace accident. But within weeks, 2 more workers vanished under similar circumstances. The project was abandoned by year's end. Then came the water. A month after the final shutdown, the bayou overflowed, an event meteorologists described as anomalous flooding. Rainfall had been minimal, yet the land itself seemed to bleed water, rising up from beneath the soil. Locals said the flood carried with it bones, porcelain fragments, and human teeth, washed downstream into the Atchafalaya Basin. Residents of nearby St. Martinville began reporting strange disturbances. Faint cries carried on the wind at night, livestock found mutilated but not eaten, and power lines flickering whenever storms passed over the area. The most chilling account came from a surveyor named William Hurst, hired by the parish to document flood damage. He claimed that during one of his inspections, he saw a figure standing knee-deep in the flooded field where the plantation once stood, a child, barefoot, holding a broken doll. When he called out, the child turned and smiled. Hurst's dash cam captured only static, but in the audio, investigators noted something faint beneath the interference. A single word whispered 3 times: "Remember, remember, remember." The land was condemned shortly after, officially declared unsafe for development due to unstable subsoil and toxic contamination. But those who've been there say it's not the ground that's unstable, it's what lies beneath it. In 2018, nearly 170 years after the Delaney Plantation burned to ash, a small legal dispute brought the story back to life. A private law firm in Baton Rouge filed a claim to verify the ownership of a parcel of land near Bayou Teche, previously classified as ancestral property. The deed was old, dated 1852, and carried a name that confounded state clerks: owner, Moses Delaney. The same Moses who, according to every historical record, had been born into slavery. The same name listed in the ledgers of Clement Delaney's breeding project. Historians were called to investigate. At first they assumed it was a clerical error, but the document's authenticity was undeniable. The paper, ink, and legal format all matched the era. More disturbing, it contained Clement Delaney's signature at the bottom, written in the same erratic hand that appeared in his surviving journals. The deed stated that the property in perpetuity shall belong to Moses Delaney and his blood descendants. It was legally binding. When genealogists attempted to trace the line, they found gaps, records missing, names erased. But one thread remained, a modern family in St. Martin Parish with the surname Caldwell, descendants of Evelyn Caldwell. DNA tests, conducted quietly and off the record, confirmed what should have been impossible. The Caldwell line shared direct genetic markers with the Delaney family. The two bloodlines had merged generations earlier, likely through one of the enslaved children born on the plantation, but it went deeper than that. Embedded in the mitochondrial DNA was a rare mutation, unclassified, never before seen in Louisiana or any regional African ancestry group. A sequence pattern forming, of all things, a spiral. Within months of the discovery, researchers who handled the genetic samples began to report strange phenomena: electronics malfunctioning, unexplainable static in recordings, and recurring nightmares of a house on fire beside a river. One lab technician, before resigning, left a note taped to her workstation. "It's not genetic, it's generational. The blood remembers." The study was abruptly shut down. The samples, sealed and transferred to a private biomedical facility in New Orleans, funded by the same corporate trust that had purchased the Delaney land decades earlier. And that's where the paper trail ends. Today, the Bayou Teche site remains restricted. Locals say lights still flicker there on stormy nights, and voices echo through the trees, singing an old lullaby no one remembers teaching their children. The spiral mark has appeared again, carved into the trunks of cypress trees, etched onto rocks that rise from the floodplain after heavy rain. Some say it's a warning, others a seal. But if you visit the archives of St. Martin Parish and request the property deeds from 1852, you'll see the name still there: bold, defiant, impossible, Moses Delaney, owner. And beneath it, written in faded red ink: "He who owns the blood, owns the land." The curse was never broken, it was only inherited. Some stories aren't meant to be solved, they're meant to be remembered. Because memory is how the past survives us. The Delaney curse wasn't born from witchcraft or superstition. It was born from greed, from the belief that a man could own another man's blood and make it serve him, even after death. The legacy of fear continues.